my long-awaited first book review of Aldous Huxley's The Perennial Philosophy. I know this is inverted, but I'm just holding it up so you all can see. This was over a month in the making. It was hard for me to read more in my schedule within the past month, but I did manage to finish it eventually. And also when it comes to non-fictional works, I do tend to take a bit of breaks when reading something that I feel like I need to digest and really grasp the knowledge that I've just kind of taken in and processing it, I suppose. And as you can see, if you can, just a flick, many green highlights as I was digesting all this information. So getting straight into it, I'll give a bit of a quick background on Aldous Huxley because it makes a lot more sense giving a bit of context into this book. So Aldous Huxley was born in 1984. He was an English writer and intellectual whose upbringing was deeply rooted in British intellectual tradition. British intellectual tradition. So his wide-ranging works includes novels, essays, and critical studies, especially critical studies. And he was known for his satirical novels, but his worldwide fame is accredited to Brave New World in 1932. It's a dystopian novel exploring the implications of state control, technology, which is a recurring theme in his works, and the loss of individuality in a future society. I am yet to read Brave New World. I've been recommended it by so many of my friends, but even today Brave New World remains as one of the most significant works of the 20th century literature. The Perennial Philosophy was published in 1945, and this book marked a significant moment in Aldous Huxley's exploration of spirituality and mysticism. He was synthesizing ideas from various religious traditions around the concept of that universal spiritual truth, as mentioned in my introduction to traditional perennialism. And if you are new to this channel, I'd recommend watching that video first before watching this book review, but it doesn't make that much of a big difference. But anyway, he had moved away from the social and political satire of his earlier works towards a more earnest exploration of spiritual and philosophical questions, which makes sense, I suppose, because once you've had enough of practical politics, you sort of expand, broaden your horizons, and then it becomes a bit of, philosophy in itself to explore. Before giving my thoughts, I do want to give the traditionalist perspective on the Perennial Philosophy and what traditionalists over time have sort of collated their views and opinions on this piece of work. So the first two positives, the first one is emphasis on perennial wisdom. So this book aligns with the traditionalist view that there is a primordial metaphysical truth at the core of all authentic spiritual traditions, and also this notion of the critique of modernity. So as traditionalists, they argue that modernity represents a deviation from the sacred and the perennial wisdom that has guided humanity for millennia. And in Huxley's book, in its rejection of modern secular values and its call for a return to spiritual depth, that essentially echoes what the traditionalist school's key concerns have been. There are, however, a few criticisms, the first one being lack of depth in metaphysics. So whilst Huxley drew from a wide range of religious traditions, he is sometimes seen as approaching them in a more eclectic, superficial manner rather than with the rigorous metaphysical precision that traditionalists value. Another one is reluctance to acknowledge hierarchy and orthodoxy. Traditionalists often stress the importance of religious orthodoxy, initiation, and that hierarchical transmission of sacred knowledge. And in Huxley's approach, which is more universalist, it's less concerned with the specific dogmas and practices of individual traditions, and that can be seen as too relativistic or syncretic. There are a few passages where he sort of critiques some traditions and spiritual practices in themselves, but he does give a whole broader view, which I will provide later on in this video. And then the last criticism from traditionalists is that they are wary of Huxley's engagement with modern ideas and his use of psychedelic experiences as a means of his spiritual exploration, which they see as symptomatic of a modern rather than a truly traditional approach to spirituality. However, I do want to defend Huxley in this criticism because his first noted experience with psychedelics occurred much later, after when he wrote the Perennial Philosophy in 1953. So when he took mescaline under the supervision of Dr. Humphrey Osmond. He was a British psychiatrist. So this experience took place, and it further influenced his path and led to the publication of The Doors of Perception in 1954, which is another one of his most famous works. And he detailed his experiences and reflections on the use of psychedelics as a tool for exploring consciousness and spiritual insight. And I think it's unfair to critique one's affairs that may have taken place after the critiqued work, as this was for Huxley another state of his consciousness operating. So, at the time of writing the Perennial Philosophy, it wasn't noted either way that he experienced psychedelics or took them. So I think it's unfair to criticize him after, when his state of consciousness writing the Perennial Philosophy was completely, in a different state. And so I'd like to defend that criticism. Okay, so here are my thoughts and my overall review, I suppose, for the book, before I delve into key themes that stood out to me. I don't think Huxley was aiming to be a spokesperson in perennialism, but it was rather an event for his frustration of his own findings and wisdom regarding society as he saw it. So it was more of a collation of his exploration rather than trying to be a representation of perennialism or a representative. He never truly left his world of politics and society either, even though he branched into spirituality, because there were just so many themes where he brought those concepts and topics in. And whilst it is clear, especially to me in this book, that Huxley believed in a God, throughout the book I also noticed that he never claims to be the very examples he provides as what a soul unified with God would entail. And so it's quite humbling of him to acknowledge this, or to have acknowledged this. He was a literary man and an author of many books, and so it would make sense that he would provide both an analytical and literary perspective and articulation of the Perennial Philosophy. And just because it's different doesn't mean it's not useful. And so that in itself was quite insightful to me. He made a strong, worthy attempt to intellectualize this philosophy in his own way as much as possible, and that is what I deem as an honorary achievement, whether one agrees with his ideas entirely, partially, or not at all. And it's a commitment for the truth nonetheless, even if one believes that they've come to a wrong conclusion or a right conclusion. It's the fact that the journey has been made to become closer. And it's like in the world of science, sometimes having theories that are proven wrong is one step closer to having that theory that is proven right. It's just the art of elimination, the process of elimination. It's always useful, but I digress. However, my personal criticism is that I found it sometimes a little bit hard to follow in some of his opinions and what he was trying to articulate, because I personally do not come from a literary background to truly grasp his natural language. But if you do come from a literary background, then I'm sure his writing would be much more appreciated, although there were some texts that he produced where I thought was brilliantly written and articulated by. Critique of politics and technology in the West. Now, I have my quotes of Huxley relevant to each theme that I'm going to explore in this book review, so I don't misquote and misread them. So the first quote that I've noted is how he compares philosophies of universal love and contrasts them to the lunatic doctrines of nationalism and racial superiority. This stood out to me, and it was very interesting. I keep saying that word interesting in all my videos. It was very intriguing that he doesn't see perennialism as an esoteric fascism. He actually rejects it. And the reason why that stood out to me is because I had come across some essays online of some people critiquing that they see traditionalism as a form of esoteric fascism. Now, I haven't fully explored this because there's so much on my plate to provide in this channel's content and lectures, but I have noted it down, and I do plan to explore some of that and why that may be the case. But I just wanted to express or just show that Huxley didn't see that at all. Another quote he says is, because technology advances, we fancy that we are making corresponding progress all along the line because we have considerable power over inanimate nature. We are convinced that we are the self-sufficient masters of our fate and captains of our souls, and believe, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, that we have only to go on being yet cleverer in a yet more systematic way to achieve social order, international peace, and personal happiness. That is quite a long statement to make. I believe that is all one sentence. But it's quite a powerfully written sentence because, I mean, I am sure for Huxley fans and for readers of his other works I'm yet to explore, and I haven't explored yet, haven't read it, but I am aware of his ideas on technological progress and how we keep thinking it's going to give us that utopian, we're doing it for the good, for that future, but then we are inadvertently living and becoming more drawn towards a dystopian nature instead. But then there is that notion that utopia is inadvertently dystopia anyway. And so, the idea of having a systematic, organized way is sort of critiquing that, because we think to do this approach to achieve, personal happiness as well as international peace, it's having the opposite effect, and he's quite anti-technology in that way. Now you might be thinking, why am I bringing this up for the perennial philosophy, and why did he bring it up as well? And essentially it's important, I think, to understand that before society can even grasp the concept of spirituality or the nature of God and the purpose of religion and faith, etc., we need to understand where its mindset as a whole is currently deeply rooted in. And unfortunately, it is in the state of politics and technology, with this quote being for technology. And for politics, he says that never has so many capable writers warned mankind against the dangers of wrong speech, and never have words been used more recklessly by politicians or taken more seriously by the public. So he's critiquing politicians, how the way of media isn't reliable at all. It still goes on today with how easily media can be fabricated or manipulated into telling different storylines from just this one footage, this one perspective, etc. And he says it's reckless. It's done recklessly. And he's obviously making the politicians responsible in this context, but he's also taking the public responsible too for taking it seriously, which is important as well, because we can't fully just blame where the sources of information are coming from, but we are also responsible for how we digest such information. And as I've mentioned probably in other videos as well, it's having that Socratic thinking, which I always advocate. Questioning, criticizing, is this the truth, and does this reality align to my values as an individual, and also as a society as well. And so another criticism that he introduces is that modern man no longer regards nature as being in any sense divine and feels perfectly free to behave towards her as an overweening conqueror and tyrant. I love that he says modern man. It gives a lot of René Guénon vibes, even though I haven't even read all of his works yet. But just that notion of traditionalism and the critique of modernity, it's great that Huxley, even though it might not be to the full extent, he's still critiquing modern man. And nature, seeing it as divine, as sacred, and he's criticizing how we as the human race have not been looking after, this part of divine nature, this part of divinity that's been given to us, that we are part of and not separate from. And I may have mentioned this before in a previous video. It's this, some argue misinterpretation, but in the Christian theology, this dominion over nature concept, Huxley is kind of hinting as, the overweening conqueror and tyrant. We should be working alongside. It's more of I think, eventually in the book, there's a theme of going along with the Taoist nature of being one with nature, being with the flow of it, and not necessarily trying to control it, which politics and technology have really, gotten their hands into. And throughout the book as well, he does criticize the education system also, which is another theme. But I'm going to just tie that in with this theme. I don't have any quotes for that, just because there was nothing that really stood out that I felt like was relevant to this video. But the last quote for this theme is quite intriguing. It's quite fascinating, because he says this: because Christians believed that there had been only one avatar, Christian history has been disgraced by more and bloodier crusades, interdenominational wars, persecutions, and proselytizing? Yeah, I think I pronounced that right. And proselytizing imperialism than has the history of Hinduism and Buddhism. Now, Huxley has obviously been brought up in a Christian background, just within the context of his time. So obviously he is saying Christianity as what he's been known for to study, and obviously it's his heritage and he's living in the West. But I am acknowledging that that is the case in Judaism and Islam as well, in terms of the Abrahamic kind of role play that has been playing out throughout our history and even to today. And it's very interesting that he compares this to the history of Hinduism and Buddhism, and the way he says it is quite ironic. It's quite a heavy criticism, but it's one that should be taken seriously, because I don't really see anything false about it. And he does bring this up as well, of the nature of Hinduism and Buddhism being more peaceful. And so he does eventually in the book as well criticize organized religion. He appreciates them but also criticizes them. So he's not necessarily anti, he's just giving a well-rounded view on this matter. So this theme is, I've written as critique of politics and technology in the West, but it's also just anything systematically. It's like system, order, education system, the religious system, the technology system, the politics system, anything that has got an organization type of play, type of workings. This is what this theme is trying to encapsulate. Religion and Temperament is a chapter where I just found the entirety of it very captivating, because it was just a lot of ideas that I felt like I was actually learning something new, and it just made me think a bit differently as well. I found it very useful. And so one of his quotes is, "The Indians admit the right of individuals with different dharmas to worship different aspects or conceptions of the divine. Hence the almost total absence among Hindus and Buddhists of bloody persecutions, religious wars, and proselytizing imperialism." So he's using the same, notion from the previous theme of criticizing the Abrahamic religions for wars, bloodshed, imperialism, with this notion that with these religions, it's often that you have to follow this certain way and that is it. And maybe within the spiritual esoteric sectors of it, it's more free-flowing. But in terms of the practical Abrahamic side, the practical side of these Abrahamic religions that I have seen, and within the different sectors as well of each religion, it's like, you do it this one way, or it's essentially not good enough. And I don't want to necessarily insult any religion, but in comparison to Hinduism and Buddhism, this idea of acknowledging different states of consciousness, the different capacities within people to follow or worship different aspects of God is quite, I don't even think inviting is the right word, inclusive. And it's inclusive and more respectable isn't the right word either. It's something along the lines of loving. It's nurturing. It's quite a loving, nurturing way to allow people to have a bit of a leeway and an acknowledging. It's like with the concept of neurodivergence, and how people with different mentalities, with the way their brain works, etc. It's like acknowledging them and fitting them along with our society and not isolating them. So it makes sense that that concept can be similarly contrasted with religion, that, you know, that one way may not work for that one person, and having different avenues, different doors to at least let someone into the club, so to speak. It's less likely that there will be disagreements or criticism, or this culture of shaming each other for not doing it for that one single way, etc. And it makes sense that, you know, this may be the very reason why Hinduism and Buddhism, you know, haven't really had any wars, anything notably shocking, terrifying, horrifying in its history in comparison to Abrahamic religion. Which, you know, Huxley is criticizing all in this, you know, 2 sentences. It's quite powerful, and he delves more into this. He brings up Dr. William Sheldon's biophysical classification. I have been completely new to this, so it was my first time learning. Found it incredibly fascinating because I am from a science background as well, so I do like to think analytically. And as with all classification, it's not necessarily like everyone is going to fully fit in it, but it's that consensus, it's that template, recipe, just sort of a generalized knowledge to kind of see where we are conforming as a society. And so he gives, Sheldon, 3 body types and associated temperaments. I'm going to try my best to pronounce them right. So endomorphy, which is another word for viscerotonia. This group of people are known to be sociable, comfort-loving, emotionally expressive. Mesomorphy, which is associated with somatotonia. They are known to be muscular, aggressive, action-oriented. And the last body type is ectomorphy, associated with cerebrotonia. And these people are known to be thin, introverted, and intellectually focused. And I believe it's Sheldon that makes the correlation between the physical types and spiritual paths, or if it was Huxley, I'm not too sure, I can't recall, which is my bad. But I think it is Huxley that brings this insight into his book, because it was a whole chapter and it was really interesting. So he makes the correlation that the viscerotonic people are inclined towards the path of devotion. So they follow dogmas. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. They're social creatures, like I've mentioned before, comfort loving, emotionally expressive. So they're towards having a bit more faith, blind faith, and just, more faithful. The somatotonic physical types, they are more suited to the path of works, which sort of makes sense because if they're known to be muscular, aggressive, and action-oriented, then it makes sense that when it comes to religion or faith, they may follow physical practices and tradition and, the notion of going to church or going to the mosque and doing prayers on Friday or church on Sunday, fasting, etc., and following these sets of guidelines. It works really well for mesomorphy, the somatotonic people. And then last but not least, the cerebrotonic people, the thin, introverted, intellectually focused, they are more drawn to the path of knowledge, which is very interesting for Huxley to bring about because it is sort of makes sense. They're sort of more thinkers, essentially overthinkers. That's the nature of trying to find the path of knowledge and wisdom and learning the truth. So they go above and beyond. They're probably most likely criticizing dogmas, rituals, practices, and politics, society, just anything and everything. Socratic approach. And it's very interesting that there's a correlation between physical types and spiritual paths in Huxley's view. I kind of like the idea of exploring this. Maybe in a video in itself, I always say this, because so many topics can be, further analysed in a video. And hope it doesn't give away which category of body type and spiritual path I fall in. But I do see in my own life and with the people I know that there is a correlation that I can replicate in them. I know people that are more muscular, more gym focused, and they prefer religion, traditions and culture and following a certain way through action. But then I also know people that love socializing and they're just more happy-go-lucky people and faith. Then you have the introverted, skinny people. I mean, obviously this is, not written in stone. You can have different body types, I'm sure, and still overflow between these spiritual paths. But introverted, intellectually focused, sitting within doors and just studying, etc. I know that for myself as well as other people as well. So it's quite an interesting classification, biophysical. I think there's so much more to explore in this. I think it's very exciting, and I do like the concept of like personality types, etc., and loads of classifications. It's quite interesting to give us more insight into how we are grouped in society quite naturally as well. This isn't it doesn't seem like this classification was made to separate people like in politics, parties and religious sects. This is more of a classification based on observation from what is naturally occurring. And I'd like to end this theme with another quote of Huxley, who says this: but the dharma or duty of any given individual is not to remain complacently fixed in the imperfect religion that happens to suit him. It is rather to transcend it, not by impossibly denying the modes of thought, behavior, and feeling that are natural to him, but by making use of them, so that by means of nature he may pass beyond nature. I love this. It's quite I'd like to think it's quite a cosmic, if that is an adjective, quite a cosmic sentence, statement, because at the end of the day, we shouldn't really be confined to our own classifications. It's great as a way to observe what we're naturally leaning to, but then that acknowledgement in itself is the first step, the first way to have a broader capacity within ourselves to transcend, go beyond nature, go beyond these limitations, these confinements, because we are, at the end of the day, multidimensional beings. We are more than, the limitations that we perceive in this 3D physical reality. And so the dharma, the duty, responsibility of each individual. It shouldn't be complacent. It should utilize what its responsibility is, essentially, like I've just said, to go beyond just thinking, rationalizing, but going beyond nature with it. And I think that's a beautiful way of seeing things in a more peaceful manner. This is quite a short theme in this video, but in the book it's quite prevalent, and it is a whole chapter in itself, but he does bring it up in other chapters, which is mortification. So this process of, I wouldn't say diminishing the ego, but the dying of the self to then be reunited with God. And so I'll give a few quotes here. One of them isn't from Huxley himself, but he quotes St. John of the Cross, who says, "The fitting disposition for union with God is not that the soul should understand, feel, taste, or imagine anything on the subject of the nature of God or any other thing whatever, but should remain in that pureness and love which is perfect resignation and complete detachment from all things for God alone." So the concept of detachment as well is prevalent throughout the book, and I also really find this important in my own life and practicing it. And being one with God essentially has to be detached from materialistic worldly desires, because you are all that is. And I think that is essentially what St. John of the Cross is saying, to not rely on our physical 3D senses as the nature of God, but going beyond that through pureness, love. And through that, we can only do that by resigning, by detaching and letting go, which is quite a beautiful quote. And another quote that Huxley gives is that one cannot know created nature in all its essentially sacred beauty unless one first unlearns the dirty devices of adult humanity. So again, this dying to the old self, maybe it could be interpreted as getting rid of the ego, although I'd like to do a video on how the ego doesn't necessarily have to be a great thing or a bad thing, depending on how you navigate it. But essentially, because of the way we've been brought up in this society and being attached to this world, it's quite normal for us. It's essentially shedding those away bit by bit, so then we could be pure, one with nature, and then realize our own sacred beauty with the divine. And last but not least, another quote on this topic is, "If, therefore, thou desires a safe stair and short path to arrive at the end of true bliss, then, with an intent mind, earnestly desire and aspire after continual cleanses of heart and purity of mind." It's a lovely sentence. So again, the same theme of make the intention first before going straight into trying to detach and let go, because you might fall into the trap of ego, trying to get rid of ego, which is essentially ego in itself. So when you earnestly desire it after continuously cleansing yourself, forgiving yourself as well, and then trying again, that is when you come closer to love and the purity of your mind, and building essentially the habit so that you become it, which I think is what he's trying to say. Other than religion and temperament, this theme is probably one of my favorites that I've explored in this book, because I've always loved the study of time and eternity, just anything to do with time. And I think that's probably why I've been so drawn to Taoist teachings, because they explore that a lot more. So this theme, time and eternity, I've got quite a lot of quotes to pull up from this book, from this chapter. This itself was a chapter in the book. So Huxley says, "The body is always in time, the spirit is always timeless," which I love. It makes sense because this body was designed as a vessel, in my opinion, for this 3D physical world. But our souls, it just makes sense that we transcend above and beyond that through our consciousness. And he quotes Eckhart, who says, "Time is what keeps the light from reaching us. There is no greater obstacle to God than time. quite an interesting statement to make. I can see why he says that, and I do agree with it to a certain extent. We've got the experience of time for a reason, so there must be some positives with it. If everything happened all at once, we couldn't truly experience and enjoy the processes that we have within our lives. We couldn't appreciate them. Sometimes time being slow for us and limited allows us to appreciate. You know, you don't know what you've got until it's gone type of thing, mentality. But it was still a lovely quote. Another one is, "It is here that we discover the essential difference between the politics of eternity philosophers and the politics of time philosophers. For the latter, the ultimate good is to be found in the temporal world, in a future where everyone will be happy because all are doing and thinking something either entirely new and unprecedented, or alternatively, something old, traditional, and hallowed. And because the ultimate good lies in time, they feel justified in making use of any temporal means for achieving it." I think this has to be one of my favorite quotes of Huxley in this book, because I really liked how he categorized eternity philosophers and time philosophers having completely different politics. And I think he is hinting towards political pseudo-religions, you know, based on time, Abrahamic religions based on time, you know, the afterlife or the world ending, etc., and how actions are made now for that ending that may or may not come. It's obviously according to people's beliefs. And so he's criticizing that some of these actions, especially when it gets a bit too fanatical and you have terrorist organizations, and I am digressing a little bit, but it is important, that believe that what they're doing is right. It justifies the violence in their minds for a vision, a religious vision, taken out of context, manipulated, or just adhere to their personal, individual ego. And it makes sense for Huxley to criticize this, because that is the cause, or one of the causes of this, and it's, you know, living in a time-bounded philosophy rather than an eternity one. So I guess he is insinuating as well, you know, the eternity philosophers are more so of Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, you know, people that are believing that eternity, the eternal present, is right now. There is no past and no future, etc. And so if we valued the now, how would we be treating society, politics, other people? If this was all there is right now, would we really try to justify any sort of violence right now if it wasn't based on a future that may not exist? It's quite a big thing to think about. And so he goes on and says, "From the records of history, it seems to be abundantly clear that most of the religions and philosophies which take time too seriously are correlated with political theories that inculcate and justify the use of large-scale violence." History has written this in stone, and I know this might touch a sensitive nerve in a lot of Abrahamic religious people. I also come from an Abrahamic religious background, so I understand this as well, that, you know, it's not the book or the scripture, it is the people, but there are acknowledgements of war and religious wars in these scriptures, and it's important that if we are to acknowledge, honor truth, and at the end of the day honor God, because God is truth, God is love, etc., then we have to criticize this. We have to acknowledge this, because this statement isn't completely false. And so, you know, large-scale violence has been, like, we think about the Crusades and all the religious wars and empires, etc., mixing in politics and religion. We have to acknowledge this, and Huxley does so in many times. He even says, in Catholic Europe, as in India, there was an effort to subordinate temporal power to spiritual authority, but since the Church exercised temporal power through the agency of political prelates and businessmen. Mittered. The effort was never more than partially successful. So he's basically saying to really try and mix temporal power to spiritual authority, it's not a great mix. It's never been completely successful. And this is what Catholic Europe had tried to do with its hierarchy of churches and delegations of power, etc. And he does criticize, the role of the church in our history as well. So it's definitely something that I would like to explore more. And he also says, with this long last quote, the reign of violence will never come to an end until, first, most human beings accept the same true philosophy of life, until second, this perennial philosophy is recognized as the highest factor common to all the world religions, until third, the adherents of every religion renounce the idolatrous time philosophies with which in their own particular faith the perennial philosophy of eternity has been overlaid, until fourth, there is a worldwide rejection of all the political pseudo-religions, justify and commend the commission of every sort of present antiquity as a means to that end. Quite a mouthful, but I think this is what Huxley might seem as his, I wouldn't want to say utopia, but his desired way of society, of living. And I couldn't bring myself to fully disagree with it, just because I come from a perennial type of mindset, a generalist mindset. And it's interesting because he's acknowledging the world religions that are based on time philosophies. He's criticizing it by calling it idolatrous, but he's also saying that having their own faith, their particular faith, is basically fine once the eternity philosophy which perennialism brings has been overlaid. So he is acknowledging that these religions can have their individual faiths, but if it can somehow be converted, maybe that's not the word he would have used. I think, well, he says overlaid, so how one can convert time philosophy to an eternity philosophy, I think this is where esotericism comes in, just from my limited knowledge so far in my journey. So with Islam, you have Sufism. With Christianity, you have Christian mysticism. Within Judaism, you have the Kabbalah, the Kabbalistic tradition. I'm sure it's called the Kabbalah. I may be wrong. I do apologize if I am. And for the Abrahamic religions that are, fully absorbed into time philosophies, I see those sectors, those esoteric sectors, as the eternity sectors of some of these religions. And so maybe if they were given more light, more awareness, which is what this channel is essentially trying to bring as well, then maybe it's a way of, it's not changing the religion, but just giving a more perennial, broader perspective. It's taking into account not just this one way of life, but also acknowledging the rest of the world, the rest of God's creation. I suppose I am going a bit more longer than anticipated on this topic, but it's like acknowledging that the rest of the world and their own cultures and religions are also part of God's creation. And so we shouldn't just acknowledge them lightly and then dismiss them. I feel like we have to try and understand, truly understand, because then once that understanding takes place, then we can apply rational thinking and come to a more conclusion where, like Huxley says, the perennial philosophy recognizes as the highest common factor. And then that comes into conversations with unity, with peace, with working with each other, and then working towards being harmonious for the divine, for God, etc. That is essentially my own opinions on this topic with integrating time and eternity with politics and religion and society, etc. But it was a brilliant chapter, and definitely something I will be exploring. Delving into the more supernatural side of things, manifestation, prayers, and magic. This was quite interesting because, and I didn't make note of this, I'm just coming off with memory. Huxley brought up the PK effect, which, when I did very light research, it was essentially studies and a theory of essentially manifestation of what we know of today, and that your thoughts kind of shape your reality and attract these things. But Huxley acknowledges supernatural powers like psychic abilities, healing abilities, etc. And I found it incredibly interesting of how he's been saying things that really relate to what we as a society have been sharing on the internet regarding the manifestation community, the New Age concepts, etc. So one of his quotes is, "All the ugly business of sacrifice, incantation, and what Jesus called vain repetition is a product of this wish to treat God as a means to indefinite self-aggrandizement, rather than as an end to be reached through total self-denial." So Huxley is already criticizing, as what Jesus called vain repetition. The New Age terminology for today is robotic affirming. So when you're doing that as a way to get things rather than actually being united with God, in the sense of working on a new concept of self and your relationship with God and who you actually are in this reality, etc. And then, if you're doing it as a means to getting something, he calls this all like an ugly business. And I'm bringing up robotic affirmations, but I believe the idea of sacrifice, incantation, different practices, do this even in traditional religions. The Abrahamic religions have their own way, and witchcraft, etc., and paganism, rituals. So he's not necessarily criticizing who uses them, it's the act itself for the reason it's being used for. And he does mention that they actually do produce fruits. So he's not acknowledging that they don't work, even when you do it in a way that's not even when you do it in a selfish way or in an egotistical way, where you're doing things to get, using God's power, delegated power to just get things through prayers. He's saying it does work still. But he also mentions autosuggestion and criticizes it. Now, I'm not too sure if this term was coined by Frederick Dodson. I don't know if it's just something I've pulled out of my memory. I haven't researched, but I believe that was a term coined by a New Age thinker, and I'm not too sure if Huxley took a dig at that and correlating that with the vain repetition that Jesus himself criticized as well. But he's basically, acknowledging the development of supernatural powers and things like psychic healing and extra sensory perception to be real. He also says that all of this is a form of compulsory magic. So these sacrifices, incantations, these prayers of repetition, he calls them a form of compulsory magic. Rites and vain repetitions have a legitimate place in religion as aids to recollectedness, reminders of truth momentarily forgotten in the turmoil of worldly distractions. When spoken or performed as a kind of magic, their use is either completely pointless or else, and this is worse, it may have ego-enhancing results, which do not in any way contribute to the attainment of man's final end. For more context, throughout the book, Huxley calls man's final end as essentially his reunion with God, and the concept of mortification, dying to the old self. And I thought it was brilliantly written. He says, and this is worse, it may have ego-enhancing results. And this is essentially why, when I talk about reality creation on this channel, I really am criticizing the modern way of thinking towards this whole New Age manifestation techniques and doing all these to get, when we're not really figuring out what our true desires are, what we really want, what's really good for us, and essentially our union with God, which I believe is our final end. And when we try and do all these rituals, prayers, and kind of whatever your technique is, whether it's through a religious tradition or even if it's through a New Age tradition, he is saying, and I do agree with this, that it should be a reminder of who you are with God. one with the Father, one with the Tao, one with Brahman, one with Allah, with ultimate reality, whatever you call it. And yeah, to do it to remind yourself, but when you do it to get lost in the world of distractions, worldly distractions, materialism, and it's having an opposite effect. It's taking you away from what the goal should be, essentially. A lot to digest for this one, but I'd probably bring up most of these concepts in my future reality creation free-flow talks. But it was really nice to see how this was written quite a while ago, but it can really apply to today's manifestation community. The last theme, which is rituals, tradition, and ceremonies. Now, this is sort of a continuation to the previous theme. It's just going more towards the religious side of it. So Huxley, first of all, states, the very large numbers of men and women have an ineradicable desire for rites and ceremonies is clearly demonstrated by the history of religion. So, makes sense. We as humans, we've formed all these practices, techniques, rituals, a way to try and keep us in check with God, but then over time, it's easy to just see it as vain repetition and vain acts and lose sense of the meaning. But the notion that we as humans need some sort of discipline has clearly been demonstrated. But Huxley does criticize. Almost all the Hebrew prophets were opposed to ritualism. And yet, in spite of the fact that what the prophets wrote was regarded as divinely inspired, the temple at Jerusalem continued to be, for hundreds of years after their time, the center of a religion of rites, ceremonials, and blood sacrifice. And he does go on to say more about blood sacrifice, but I just thought I'd leave it out for this video. So again, he's pointing out this irony of, you know, this wasn't necessarily preached, and yet we as humans have been just doing it anyway. It's almost like we're just so inclined, we can't help ourselves. And he also goes on within Christianity by saying the Christ of the Gospels is a preacher and not a dispenser of sacraments or performer of rites. He speaks against vain repetitions. He insists on the supreme importance of private worship. He has no use for sacrifices and not much use for the temple, but this did not prevent historic Christianity from going its own all too human way. Now, I personally do not criticize these rites and rituals being formed as a way to remind yourself, and that is what Huxley is saying. He said it in the last theme as well. When it's a reminder, it's great. It's doing its job. It's taking you to man's final end. But then, because of our human nature, and suppose this is maybe the test from God, if one likes to believe so, that when it gets to a point where you're doing it and you're losing your spirituality, then the rites itself, these traditions, these prayers, these spiritual practices, they sort of, it's not the practices themselves, it's who you are being as the process. And I suppose this is a new, quite a common thing in new manifestation, new age content around, where they say techniques do not manifest, you do. The techniques are not the process, you are. And again, I guess that is the same concept. He says, first, most people do not want spirituality or deliverance, but rather a religion that gives them emotional satisfactions, answers to prayers, supernormal powers, and partial salvation in some sort of posthumous heaven. I love this sentence. Second, most of those few who do desire spirituality and deliverance find that for them, the most effective means to those ends are ceremonies, vain repetitions, and sacramental rites. So he's acknowledging that there's two ways of using it, but it's really just the person's intentions, essentially. I mean, what is the difference between a New Age manifestation believer doing all these techniques, scripting, robotic affirmations, visualizing, compared to a Muslim praying 5 times a day with the same prayers and intentions of wanting something in this worldly life. And I'm not criticizing that. We all have desires, and I do acknowledge materialistic desires as being healthy, but I always advocate that that's not the only thing that we should be focusing on. There is a balance. But when that balance is over-tipped in the favor of asking God, doing all these ceremonies, you only pray when you want something or when things are getting bad, then it just is a time to sit back and criticize yourself in a healthy way of, is this the kind of person that I want to be? And do I really seek these desires, or do I seek the provider of these desires and reuniting with him or with God or the universe instead? And he goes on to say that everything, event or thought, can therefore be made the doorway through which a soul may pass out of time into eternity. That is why ritualistic and sacramental religion can lead to deliverance. But at the same time, every human being loves power and self-enhancement, and every hallowed ceremony, form of words, or sacramental rite is a channel through which power can flow out of the fascinating psychic universe into the universe of embodied cells. That is why ritualistic and sacramental religion can also lead away from deliverance. Just great how he articulates this. I mean, I suppose it's his literary skills, but I just thought it was a great read, because he's acknowledging both sides. And I think this may be why a lot of traditionalists may not like his, he's not fully loving tradition, but he's not fully hating it either. And obviously, for traditionalists, they're all for tradition and sacred knowledge, etc. So I suppose I can understand why they don't necessarily agree with Huxley on this, but I can personally, even though I like to support traditionalist values, I can see why this is the case. I can understand Huxley from this point of view. Everyone, whether they want to admit or not, there is a sense of wanting self-improvement, self-enhancement, and that is never truly a bad thing. But when it comes, again, there's a balance to these things. When the scales are tipped in the favor of power, there's just the pathway to potential corruption. Then it just gets to a point where it's leading us away from man's final end, or that reunion with God, and just our purpose, figuring our soul's desires, etc. And I would like to end this theme with the last quote. The man who has learnt to regard things as symbols, persons, as temples of the Holy Spirit, and actions as sacraments, is a man who has learned constantly to remind himself who he is, where he stands in relation to the universe and its ground, how he should behave towards his fellows, and what he must do to come to his final end. I think that's such a beautiful statement to make. Take these traditions, these rituals, these techniques as what you'd like to call it. It's at the end of the day who you are, what you are trying to constantly learn, what you are reminding yourself who you are. When you are one with God, you acknowledge that so is everyone else, and so your relationship to God, the universe, to people, to nature, how you're treating every single big aspect of creation is what essentially will lead you to how you come to your final end. And I don't mean in this lifetime, I mean in a soul-like way, achieving your soul's purpose. And I think that was a beautiful statement to end this theme on. For this conclusion, I would like to end this book review on 3 quotes from Huxley's The Perennial Philosophy that stood out to me. The first one being, for them, the important thing is that the individual men and women should come to the unitive knowledge of the divine ground, and what interests them in regard to the social environment is not its progressiveness or non-progressiveness, whatever those terms may mean, but the degree to which it helps or hinders individuals in their advance towards man's final end. Again, beautifully written. It's not necessarily about progressing not progressing, or just being so attached to the politics of the social environment, but more so as how are we helping each other as a community towards reuniting with God, being the best versions of ourselves, fulfilling our soul's desires, and just essentially when we do connect with God, are we living up to those expectations? And another quote which really stood out to me was, human experience can be thought about as effectively in Chinese as in English or French. But in practice, Chinese is the best language for those brought up in China, English for those brought up in England, and French for those brought up in France. I believe this quote is a nice conclusion for that religion and temperament theme of acknowledging different states of consciousness, different capacities of thinking, to all lead to the same path and the same final end. And then the last quote, which is from the Srimad Bhagavatam, if I pronounced that correctly. Like the bee gathering honey from different flowers, the wise man accepts the essence of different scriptures and sees only the good in all religions. Again, another beautiful quote that really encapsulates perennialism. And, in this book, Huxley didn't just talk about religion, and that is it. He talked about a lot of practical topics, which I think should really be explored. Politics, society, even technology. I guess he could never escape his distaste for technology, but manifestations, science, ceremonies, rituals, etc. Just everything. He really brings that perennial thinking, the mindset into all of these topics. And so my conclusion for this entire book review, I'm just reading off my notes that I put on here. I believe this book is worth reading for an introduction to perennialism, but not necessarily traditional perennialism, as that is a different branch. I still believe it's useful knowledge nonetheless, and I always advocate for acknowledging other perspectives rather than judging it too much, because it may just be the very opinions your soul aligns to. You never know until you truly explore with a sincere heart and mind. Huxley has impressively explored a wide range of religious beliefs, as evident in his deliverance of quotes from many spiritual greats to further strengthen his points and topics, which is another thing I forgot to mention. Throughout the book, he always brings loads of quotes, like I said, from spiritual greats. And it's from like Sufism, Christian mysticism, even German mysticism, just so many. It's brilliantly wide-ranged. And I really like how he incorporates all of his collated knowledge, his experience, and he applies it to our human history and current political and social states of the West in particular, but also in a worldwide manner. I, being brought up in the West, it's very applicable to me. And so far in my journey, I haven't seen this in traditionalism, but I do deem it imperative to address and to allow practical integration for this philosophy. I hope this book review was really insightful and helpful in one's journey for wisdom. Do stay tuned on my channel's community post, because I will reveal the next book that I will be reading and giving a book review on. And before I end this video, with my disclaimer that I am by no means claiming that I am knowledgeable in everything, except that I am in the humble pursuit of wisdom. Thank you for watching.